The candles at Vanemore had been burning for 2 hours when Cecily Ashmore walked into the long dining room, and the conversation very nearly stopped. It was not her face that caused it, though she was composed enough for October, with grief only a month removed from its sharpest edge. It was not her rank, which was sufficient but unremarkable. It was the gown. Ivory silk, cut in the style of a decade past, with a hem embroidered in wisteria clusters so precise and fine that they seemed to grow from the fabric rather than sit atop it. Every woman of a certain age in that room knew it. Several of them had seen it before. Not on this young woman. Not on Cecily Ashmore, who had been a child in pigtails the last time this gown appeared in a formal room, but on her mother, Catherine, Lady Ashmore, who had worn it at her own presentation to the Queen 22 years ago, and then folded it into cedar and cedar and cedar, and never brought it out again. Catherine Ashmore had been dead for 7 months. Lord Vane noticed it from his position at the head of the table, which was the position from which he noticed everything. He was not a man given to sentiment about fabric, but he was a man with a precise memory. And the wisteria hem stirred something he had not anticipated. He did not permit it to show on his face. He indicated to the footman that Miss Ashmore's chair should be drawn out, and he continued his conversation with the magistrate, Sir Frederick Ogilvy, as if nothing had shifted in the room. Roland Fitch did not have Edmund Hartwell's discipline. He was seated 4 chairs down on the left side, his wife Horatio arranged at his elbow, and he looked at the gown, and then at the young woman inside it, and his mouth compressed in the way of a man who has had his morning letter arrive before breakfast and finds the news predictable. "Miss Ashmore," he said, the words polite enough in surface, thin underneath. "I did not know you would be attending." Cecily sat down. She spread her napkin across the ivory silk with the care of someone who had learned, in the last 7 months, to do everything with excessive care, as a way of keeping her hands busy and her expression still. "I was invited, Mr. Fitch," she said. "Nothing else." He smiled. Lord Vane watched him smile. He watched Cecily watch the smile, and then look away, toward the silver candlesticks, which she studied with the particular attention people bring to objects when they are deciding what to feel. She had worn the gown on purpose. He understood that, in the way he understood most things that happened in rooms before they were named aloud. Catherine Ashmore's daughter had dressed herself in Catherine Ashmore's most recognizable garment and walked into a room full of people who remembered it, and sat down across from the man who was currently attempting to take Catherine Ashmore's estate. The gown was not a plea. It was a statement of lineage, worn on the body, in silk, with a wisteria hem that could not be forged. What she intended to do with the statement, beyond make it, Edmund did not yet know. He would find out. He was not entirely certain why he was so sure of this, except that the evening had acquired a quality of necessity he had not expected when he had planned the dinner, and that the young woman in the ivory gown was looking at the candlesticks with an expression that reminded him of someone navigating a room they expected to have to leave quickly, having memorized all the exits. He had seen that expression before. He had worn it himself, at the inquest after Eleanor. The soup arrived. The conversation resumed. Cecily Ashmore ate with perfect manners and said very little, and Lord Vane found himself noting, without particular reason, exactly where she was in the room at every moment of the evening, the way one noted the position of a candle in a draught. The foreshadow was already in him, though he would not name it for weeks yet. What he knew, as he watched Roland Fitch refill his glass and speak too loudly to the magistrate about the importance of clear succession in estate law, was that Catherine Ashmore had been his friend for 15 years, had been present the winter Eleanor died, and had not offered him platitudes, and that her daughter was sitting in a room full of people who were not yet paying the right kind of attention to what she had chosen to wear. He, however, was Catherine Ashmore, Countess of Thornley in her own right, had held Thornley Hall for 31 years by the time she died. The title had come through her mother's line, one of the rare instances of a Regency-era earldom with a letters patent permitting female succession, and Catherine had administered it with the kind of quiet iron competence that men in the county tended to describe, with some relief, as good sense in a woman. She had overseen the renovations of the East Wing after the flood of 1807. She had negotiated the tenants' rents through 3 poor harvests without a single eviction. She had employed 9 servants, paid them on time, and known each of their children's names. She had been Cecily's mother, and her father's wife, and the keeper of a place that had been in her family for 4 generations before it came to her. Cecily had grown up understanding that Thornley was a living thing, not a possession. Her mother had taught her that the accounts were not tedium, but duty, that the oak in the lower pasture had been planted by a great-grandmother whose portrait hung in the gallery, that the cedar chest in the dressing room held things that mattered not because they were valuable, but because they were proof of continuity, of presence, of the particular shape of a life lived in one place across time. Her mother had died in March, a slow illness that had given them 3 months of shortened afternoons, of reading aloud, of hands held. Cecily had been there for all of it, and had thought, naively, that because she had been there and had not looked away, the world afterward might extend her a small mercy. It had not. Roland Fitch appeared at Thornley 7 weeks after the funeral, armed with a solicitor named Graves and a document asserting that the letters patent permitting female succession had been superseded by a later statute. Graves was a neat man who spoke in careful sentences and did not look at Cecily directly when he explained the legal position. Fitch looked at her. He looked at her the way one looks at a problem that is largely already solved, with a kind of impatient sympathy for the problem's feelings. "You will, of course, retain a small income," Fitch had said. "Your mother would have wanted you comfortable." Cecily had thanked him in a voice that revealed nothing, and had returned to her mother's dressing room and stood for some time in the smell of cedar and dried lavender, pressing her hands flat against the top of the cedar chest. She had opened the chest to retrieve her mother's shawl, which she had wanted for practical reasons. She had found the gown first. The ivory silk, folded in tissue, exactly as she remembered from the afternoon they had repaired the hem together. Cecily had been 15, and her mother had said, working a needle through the wisteria with the precision of long practice, "This gown was the first time anyone in London saw me as I actually was. Not as my father's daughter. Not as a title to be settled. Just myself, in a room. Visible." She had tied off the thread and held the hem up to the light. "I should like you to have it when I am done with it." Underneath the gown, in an envelope sealed with the Ashmore crest, was the codicil. Cecily had known her mother's hand at a glance. The document was 3 pages, witnessed by 2 signatures she did not recognize, and one she did. E. Hartwell, Earl of Vane, dated November 1815, 4 months before her mother died. She had stood in the dressing room for a long time, reading. The codicil superseded the standard entail provision, established a trust that named Cecily as primary heir, and had been filed with the relevant solicitor in London. The estate was hers by her mother's explicit documented intention. Fitch and Graves had known about the codicil. Their case, she understood then, depended on whether anyone could be found to challenge its authenticity. This was when she had understood what it would cost her to hold Thornley. Her mother had told her more than once that she was not made for fighting, that she was gentle in the way of her father, a quiet scholar who had loved birds and Latin poetry, and had died of a fever when Cecily was 12. The words had never felt cruel when Catherine Ashmore said them. They had felt like a description. Cecily had believed them the way one believes a thing said often enough by someone whose opinion one trusts entirely. She had believed them until she opened the cedar chest and found her inheritance tucked beneath the gown she had been left, and understood that her mother had believed something different. Had believed it precisely enough to document it. She wore the gown to the Vanemore dinner because Edmund Hartwell had witnessed the codicil, and his signature was the one she recognized, and she needed to know, before she walked into a legal hearing, whether he remembered. She needed to know whether the signature meant what a signature was supposed to mean. He came to Thornley the next morning. Cecily heard his horse in the gravel drive and looked out the study window. It was her mother's study, which she had reclaimed from the first day, spreading the account books across the desk before Fitch's people could think to remove them. She saw Lord Vane dismounting without the particular haste of a social call, and without the studied casualness of one, either. He moved with the directness of a man who had decided to do something, and was doing it. She met him in the entrance hall, which still smelled faintly of her mother's beeswax, and the chrysanthemums she had cut from the garden that were now dying gracefully in the blue vase on the pier table. "Lord Vane," she said. "Miss Ashmore." He glanced at the hall, the doors standing open, the footman hovering at the far end. "Where is Fitch's man Graves today?" "In the village. He is expected back at noon." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "You should not be receiving him here without a witness of your own," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It had the quality of an instruction that he had already decided applied, and was only now informing her of. She could have taken it as arrogance. She registered it instead as the first sentence anyone had spoken to her in weeks that concerned itself with her position, rather than Fitch's. "I have been receiving him without a witness since October," she said. "That will change." He said it the way one says a thing that is already decided, and then he looked past her toward the study door, which she had left open. She watched him take in the desk, the ledgers, the letter half-drafted to the London solicitor, the account books stacked in the order she had established them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the study door and stood in it, looking at the room. He stood there long enough that she counted 10 seconds, and then 10 more before he spoke. "You found the discrepancies in the inventory," he said. It was not a question. 3 items misattributed. A set of silver candlesticks my grandmother brought from Bath, listed under entailed estate goods. They are not entailed. They came through the female line and belong to me, personally. She paused. Also, 2 paintings and a bureau bookcase. The candlesticks are the clearest. You documented this. It is the letter I am currently writing. He turned from the door and looked at her fully, the way he had looked at the gown the previous evening, except that now the quality of attention was uncomplicated, direct, without whatever careful distance he had been maintaining at the dinner. She felt the attention land differently in the full morning light of Thornley High's entrance hall, without candles, without other people, without the silk buffer of her mother's dress between herself and the room. She had the distinct sensation of being seen at a resolution she was not accustomed to. "Tell me about the codicil," he said. She told him. She watched his face as she described finding it, the witnesses' names, his own signature below them. She watched him absorb it without surprise, but with a particular quality of stillness that was not the stillness of a man indifferent, but the stillness of a man who had been waiting for something to arrive and had now seen it. "I was not told what the document contained," he said, when she had finished. "Your mother asked me to witness her signature to a codicil to her will. She told me only that it concerned the succession of the estate, and that she had satisfied herself on the legal question, and that my presence as a disinterested peer of the realm would provide the kind of confirmation the document required. Did you ask her what it said? I did. What did she tell you? She told me, he said, that it said exactly what she meant. Cecily was quiet. She could hear the house around her, the way she had always been able to hear it. The creak and settle of old timber, the particular quality of Thornley's silence, which was never fully silent, but layered with the breathing of a place that had been lived in for a very long time. Will you confirm the signature? She asked. Before the magistrate, before the legal hearing Fitch is planning? Will you stand as witness to the document? He did not answer immediately. This was, she would later understand, because he was calculating something she did not yet know he was calculating. He was thinking about Eleanor, and about Catherine Ashmore sitting with him in the blue drawing room the winter Eleanor died, and about the specific words Catherine had used. I shall ask you for a favor someday, Edmund, and I want you to say yes before you know what it is. He had said yes. I will require my own copy of the codicil, he said. I will need to correspond with your London solicitor to verify the filing date. Of course. And you are not to receive Graves alone again. She almost said she did not require that instruction. She almost said she had been managing for 7 months without anyone's authority over her schedule. She said neither of these things because the instruction was not arrogance, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. Thank you, Lord Vane, she said instead. He nodded and turned toward the study, and she followed him in. Fitch's solicitor Graves submitted the legal counter-argument on the 15th of October. It was 4 pages of tightly written objection, citing 3 statutes and 2 precedents, and its central argument was that the codicil had been produced by a woman in the late stages of a deteriorating illness, that the capacity to execute a legal document was therefore suspect, and that the signatures of 2 country solicitors and a neighboring earl did not constitute sufficient verification of the signatory's sound mind in the absence of a physician's attestation. Cecily read it twice. She put it face down on the desk and sat for 5 minutes. Then she turned it back over and read it a 3rd time, making notes in the margin in her mother's style, which was a system of annotation she had learned as a child watching Catherine Ashmore correspond with tenants, and which consisted of numbers in circles and a small cross wherever a statement could be countered with evidence. She crossed it throughout. Her mother had signed the codicil with the same hand she had used for every document in the last year of her life. Cecily had a year's worth of household correspondence to demonstrate it. She also had 3 letters from her mother's physician, Dr. Hadley, written in December and January, attesting to Lady Ashmore's continued mental acuity and her explicit wish to finalize her estate affairs. The letters had been sent for a different purpose. They served this one. Edmund appeared at Thornley on the 17th, ostensibly to return a book he had borrowed from the library 3 years ago and had only now located. He handed it to the footman in the entrance hall and then appeared in the study doorway without having been announced, which was either a liberty or an indication that he was treating the house with the propriety of a man who had visited it often enough not to stand on ceremony. Cecily had not decided which. She showed him Graves's counter-argument and her annotated responses. He sat in the chair across the desk and read both without comment, his hands still on the arms of the chair, his attention fully on the papers in the way of a man who did not read carelessly. When he finished, he set them down and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "The physician's letters." "Yes," she said. "When was the last?" "The 22nd of January, 3 weeks before she died." He nodded. He looked at her. She noticed that he had been doing this with increasing frequency, this quiet looking, and that each time he did it, The interval was slightly longer than the previous one, as though he were adding something to an account he was keeping, something that required accumulation rather than a single entry. "Hadley will testify?" he asked. "I have written to ask him." "He has not yet replied." "I know him," Edmund said. "I will write as well." It was the second time he had done this, expanded his involvement beyond the minimum she had requested. She was attempting to understand it. She was attempting not to think about understanding it at the same time, because thinking about it directly produced a confusion in her chest that she did not have space for. In the middle of a legal campaign she could not afford to lose. It was her friend Polly Drummond who came the following morning with the news about the assembly. Polly was 20, frank in the way of women who have never been made to feel that frankness is dangerous, and she arrived with a basket of autumn apples from her mother's garden and the expression of someone carrying information they have been trying to decide whether to deliver. "Mrs. Fitch said something at the assembly," Polly said, once they were in the morning room with tea. "To Lady Sedgwick. I was standing near the window, and I do not think she saw me." "Tell me." Polly looked at the apple in her hand. "She said that whatever legal maneuvers the grieving girl attempted, the law was clear, and they were simply waiting for Cecily to exhaust herself and accept the inevitable." She looked up. She said it pleasantly. She said it the way people say things when they are certain. Cecily took a sip of tea. She held the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth through her gloves, and looked at the window, the October garden, the oak at the edge of the lawn that had been planted by her great-great-grandmother. The grieving girl. She had heard it before, from Graves. Through the library door she had not been meant to be standing behind. She had filed it then under the category of things people said when they believed they were not observed. It was different, arriving a second time, carried by Polly's frank, uncomfortable face, from a county assembly where it had been said in company, pleasantly, as fact. She understood that to them she was not a legal opponent. She was a weather condition. Something to wait out. If you have ever watched someone refuse to be a weather condition, hold on to this story. Because what happened next was not what Roland Fitch had planned for. She put down the teacup, and she told Polly about the physician's letters. She watched the expression on her friend's face change from uncomfortable to something else, something that might, in the right circumstances, become useful. She had not planned to ask him directly. It happened because he arrived on the 20th with his own correspondence copy of the codicil, which Lady Ashmore had sent to him sealed, with a note that read only, "When you are needed." He had opened it the morning after the Vanamore dinner. He had been carrying it for 3 days. He showed her the note in the entrance hall. Catherine Ashmore's handwriting, 3 words, on a square of cream paper. Cecily held it by the edges. "When you are needed." Her mother had written those words not knowing she would be dead, had written them in November, when she was still well enough to ride, before anyone had said the word deteriorating in medical context, had written them and sealed them and sent them to the man she trusted to be standing in the right place when standing was required. Cecily had wondered, for some time, why the codicil had been in the chest rather than pressed into her hands with an explanation. She had concluded that her mother had known she would spend the remaining months worrying rather than present. It was the most generous possible interpretation, and almost certainly correct. Edmund walked with her through the Thornley Gallery that afternoon. She had asked to show him the house, partly to give herself somewhere to put the feeling of holding that 3-word note, partly because she was aware that he had been inside Thornley for weeks now, without ever having been formally received as a guest, and this struck her as an omission she should correct. He looked at the portraits with attention that suggested he was genuinely interested, asking their names and dates, occasionally asking about a landscape or an object in the background of a painting, because he recognized the geography. She asked him, in front of the portrait of her grandmother, the third Countess, who had a mouth that everyone said Cecily had inherited. She stopped in front of it. "Why are you helping me?" "Not the witness statement. I understand the witness statement. The physician. The correspondence. Being here." He was quiet for long enough that she had time to regret asking. Then he said, "Come to Vanamore. I want to show you something." They rode over in the afternoon. He took her to the Vanamore Gallery and stopped before a portrait halfway down on the right. A woman in white, seated with a kind of deliberate stillness that portraits sometimes captured and usually failed to. "My wife, Eleanor," he said. "She died in the spring of 1813. Cecily looked at the portrait and then at him. He was looking at the portrait the way he looked at account books, with the particular attention of a man who is checking his arithmetic. "Your mother came to me that winter," he said. "Not as a neighbor, as a friend. She sat with me for 3 days, the week after the funeral, when I could not make myself understand what had happened. She did not say anything useful. She did not pretend there was anything useful to say." He was quiet for a moment. His hand moved slightly, as if he had thought about touching the portrait frame and then reconsidered. Cecily was standing close enough to feel the motion without seeing it, a presence at the edge of her perception. "She told me, before she left, that she would ask me for a favor someday, and that she wanted my answer before she knew what she was asking." "You said yes," Cecily said. "I said yes." He turned from the portrait and looked at her. "She sent me the codicil 6 months before she died. She wrote, in the accompanying letter, that her daughter would need someone of rank and goodwill who understood both the legal situation and the character of the person they were vouching for." A pause. "She said she had been watching me, watch you at the county assemblies." The words landed quietly in the gallery. Cecily felt the quality of the light change, or felt herself become more aware of it. The late October afternoon came through the high windows, the particular color of English autumn pressing in. "She told me," Edmund said, "that you thought yourself not made for fighting. She said she wanted someone nearby who would be able to see you fight, so you did not have to do it entirely alone." Cecily looked at the portrait of Eleanor, at the deliberate stillness of a woman holding herself for a reason. Her mother had been watching, her mother had been planning, her mother had folded the strategy into the cedar chest with the gown and the 3 words on cream paper, and had trusted that the people she had placed in position would stand in the right places. It was the most Catherine Ashmore thing she had ever heard, and she felt the grief of it move through her like a wave. Not the sharp grief of the early months, but the older, rounder kind that carried something else inside it, something that felt almost like being accompanied. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in the Vanamore Gallery with Edmund Hartwell standing 2 feet away, looking at his wife's portrait with that careful arithmetic expression. She was going to stand here and feel her mother's hand in this, and then she was going to go home and finish the letter to Hadley and prepare for the legal hearing. "She was right," Edmund said, "about the fighting, for what that is worth." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her now, not the portrait. His face had the quality of a man who has said more than he intended and is watching to see what happens to it. "It is worth something," she said. The formal hearing was set for the 1st of November. Graves arranged it for Thornley's drawing room, which Cecily recognized as a deliberate choice. The drawing room was large and could hold 15 people. Graves brought his client, his counter documents, and 3 witnesses he had assembled to speak to the standard entail provisions. He also brought Mr. Fitch's personal solicitor from London, a man named Calloway, who had an air of expensive competence and settled into the chair at the end of the long table as though he had arranged it himself. It was Thornley's drawing room. It was her mother's furniture, her mother's carpet, the Dutch paintings her mother had hung in the particular way she had decided they should be hung because the light came from the west in the afternoon, and she had known the light. Cecily sat at her end of the table and reminded herself of this. Edmund was there, seated along the right wall in one of the chairs her mother had called the observers' chairs. He looked at Cecily when she entered and gave a small, nearly invisible nod. "I am here, and the arithmetic is still holding." She had worn the ivory gown again. It was not the practical choice. It was warm enough in November, with the police over it. But the silk was thin, and the drawing room was only minimally heated. And she had known, dressing that morning, that she would be cold. She had worn it because the codicil was in the pocket she and her mother had sewn into the hem. The pocket was her mother's innovation, added the same afternoon they repaired the wisteria, because Catherine Ashmore had kept a small folding penknife in the pockets of all her gowns, and found that formal dress never accommodated the habit. The pocket sat inside the hem, flat and invisible, just large enough for a folded document. Cecily had kept the codicil there since the morning she found it. It felt important that the document be in the dress, not in a case, not in a reticule, not on the table. In the dress. Graves opened with a statement of the legal position. Calloway followed with the counter to the codicil's validity, which was more polished than the written version and delivered without the careful hedging of the letter. He spoke of diminished capacity with regret, as one speaks of a natural condition that no one is responsible for. He mentioned the vulnerability of women in the final stages of illness. He spoke of the kindness of clear succession, the disruption prevented by following the established law. He did not once look at Cecily while he was speaking. Fitch spoke next. He arranged his face in something that resembled sorrow and addressed himself primarily to Graves, which had the effect of making Cecily feel she was being discussed rather than addressed. "We need not torment the grieving girl with documents," he said. His voice was warm, even. "The legal position is compassionate in precisely this way. It resolves uncertainty. Miss Ashmore is young. She is intelligent. She has options before her that are not limited to a house she did not, in the technical legal sense, inherit." He spread his hands. "We are trying to help her, not oppose her." The grieving girl. The third time. Said in the drawing room of Thornley Hall, in front of witnesses, with his solicitor and his wife, and the Thornley footman along the walls, said as though her name were an insufficient category for the purposes of this room. She looked at Edmund. He was very still. His hands were on the arms of the chair exactly as they had been in Thornley's study when he read Graves's counter-argument, and his face was the face of a man engaged in arithmetic of a different kind now, measuring something she could not read, adding and holding. He did not speak. He looked at her and was still. And she felt the stillness as something she was supposed to absorb, and she did not know what it meant. Only that his face had a quality she could not interpret, and that his silence, in this room, at this moment, sat in her chest like cold. She had been so certain, in the gallery and the study, that the weight of his presence meant something fixed. She had built her strategy around a man whose face she suddenly could not read, and whose silence was indistinguishable from the silence of a man who had decided this was not his fight. She looked away from him. She looked at the carpet, which her mother had chosen, which had taken 3 months to arrive from London, and which her mother had stood on in her stockinged feet the day it was laid and said, "This is exactly right." Calloway said, "We are prepared to move to the final filing within the week. If Miss Ashmore has any further documents to submit in support of her claim, we would ask that they be produced now." Cecily put her hand into the pocket in the hem of the ivory gown and found the edge of the codicil with her fingertips, the familiar fold of it, her mother's seal still intact on the outer sheet. She was cold. She was frightened. She had come here with a document and a witness and 3 months of evidence, and she looked at Edmund Hartwell's still, unreadable face and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, it does not matter. What her mother had left her was not only a man's signature. What her mother had left her was the document, the physician's letters, the inventory discrepancies documented in her own hand, and the codicil pressed into a pocket sewn by Catherine Ashmore's own needle. She would produce the document regardless. She drew it out. She set the codicil on the table in front of her. "I have the original codicil," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her that it was steady. "Signed by my mother, witnessed by 2 solicitors and by Lord Vane, and filed with the offices of Hendershot and Price in London on the 17th of November last year. I also have 3 letters from Dr. Hadley, my mother's physician, dated December 1815, January 1816, and January 1816, attesting to her continued mental acuity during the period in which the document was prepared and executed." She placed the physician's letters beside the codicil. She placed the annotated counter-argument beside those. She placed her inventory documentation, the misattributed candlesticks itemized by provenance, beside that. The papers spread across the table like something solid. Calloway looked at them. He looked at Graves. Something passed between them, an adjustment of expression, the slight contraction that happens when an expensive certainty encounters an inconvenient fact. "The question of capacity," Calloway began. Edmund stood up. He stood in a single movement, without haste, from the observer's chair along the wall. And when he stood, the quality of the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with his height, which was considerable, and everything to do with the particular authority that accumulates in a man who has exercised it responsibly for long enough that it has settled into his body and requires no performance. He crossed the room, not to Cecily's side of the table, to the center of the table, where the documents lay, where everyone in the room could see him. He looked at Calloway. "The question of capacity," he said, "was resolved the afternoon I sat with Lady Ashmore and witnessed her signature. She was precise, unambiguous, and entirely aware of what the document contained and what she was doing." He looked at Fitch. "If it would be useful, I am prepared to describe the conversation in detail, including her explanation of why the codicil was necessary and what specific provisions she wished to make for her daughter." Fitch's wife, seated near the door, stopped moving her fan. Fitch himself said, "The Earl was not told the contents." "I was told the contents," Edmund said. His voice was level and carried the room without effort. "I asked, as I stated to Miss Ashmore 3 weeks ago. Your mother told me precisely what the document said, Mr. Fitch, because she understood that a witness who does not understand what he is witnessing is not a useful witness." He paused. "I understood it. I signed it. It is a valid document, executed by a woman in possession of full legal capacity, and I will testify to that effect before any magistrate in this county." Calloway opened his mouth and closed it again. Edmund reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he placed on the table beside Cecily's documents. "My copy of the codicil, forwarded to me by Lady Ashmore in November, and kept sealed until this past month. The postmark is legible. If there is any question about the timing of the original filing, this copy establishes a matching date of execution." The room was very quiet. "She is the heir," Edmund said. "I was there when her mother made it so. This is finished. He had said them with the quality of a man stating an arithmetic conclusion, not triumph, not performance, simply an answer. The silence after them was the silence of people making adjustments to what they had believed a moment ago. Fitch looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at the 2 copies of the codicil on the table, and at the physician's letters, and at the annotated inventory documents, and his face had the expression of a man totaling a column that is not producing the number his client had been led to expect. Graves said very quietly, "Perhaps we should take the matter under advisement before the formal filing." Mrs. Fitch, from her chair near the door, said nothing. Her fan was in her lap, and she was looking at the carpet, which was her mother's carpet, chosen in stockinged feet, and Cecily was not looking at her. Cecily was looking at Edmund. He met her eyes. His face had settled back into the expression she had been unable to read 30 minutes ago, but it was legible to her now, or at least she thought it was, in the way that things become legible when you have sufficient context and the willingness to look directly. It was not indifference. It had never been indifference. It was the expression of a man who had been very quiet because he had been waiting for exactly the right moment to stand. Her mother had written those 3 words on the note. "When you are needed." He had known exactly when. She looked down at the codicil on the table. Her mother's handwriting on the outer sheet. The familiar loops. The particular way Catherine Ashmore made her capital A. She had the sensation, brief and full and not quite painful, of her mother standing in this room, in this house, saying it was exactly right. The legal hearing ended without the final filing. Calloway requested 2 weeks to consult with his client. Graves was more circumspect. Fitch accepted the adjournment with the grace of a man who has not yet decided to concede, but can no longer pretend the arithmetic is in his favor. Edmund stayed after they left. He did not say anything immediately. He stood in the drawing room when it was empty and looked at the Dutch paintings her mother had arranged according to the afternoon light, and Cecily stood beside him and let the silence of the house settle back into place around them. The familiar creak and breathe of a place that had been lived in for a very long time, and was not, after all, done being lived in. Sir Frederick Ogilvy, as the county's senior magistrate, confirmed the codicil's validity on the 19th of November. He called it a clear and properly executed document with no legal basis for challenge, given the evidence of the physician's letters, the matching copy held by Lord Vane, and Lord Vane's sworn attestation of the signatory's capacity. He noted the inventory discrepancies that Cecily had identified and ordered them corrected. He was brief and precise, and his written confirmation used the phrase Cecily Ashmore, Countess of Thornley in her own right, 5 times in 4 paragraphs, which she read once that evening, and then folded and placed in the account book, where it would be useful rather than decorative. Roland Fitch and his wife left Thornley Hall on the 21st. Calloway's final letter cited an inability to proceed. Graves brought it to Cecily himself, and she thought she detected in his careful blankness something that might, in a different context, have been respect. The servants resumed the normal patterns of the house with a collective exhale Cecily felt more than heard. Cook made her mother's recipe for ginger biscuits and left them on the morning room table, unprompted. The footman began anticipating her movements, appearing in the right rooms before she had quite decided to go to them. Thornley settled back into itself. She let it. Edmund came on the 29th, 3 weeks after the hearing, on a cold morning with frost on the grass and the last of the autumn leaves coming down from the oak in the lower pasture. He did not come on estate business, which was what he had been citing as the justification for his recent appearances. He came without his steward, without papers, without the careful transactional pretext. He asked, in the entrance hall, if she would walk in the garden. She had been expecting him. She had not examined why she had been expecting him, because examining it felt like opening a question before she had decided she was prepared to hear the answer. They walked to the rose arbor. The roses were long over, the canes bare and thorned. The stone bench her mother had placed there now cold and slightly damp from the frost. Cecily stood rather than sat and looked at the garden, the dormant beds, the oak at the field's edge, the gray stone of the hall behind her. Edmund stood beside her at a proper social distance and said nothing for a moment. She was acutely aware of him, had been for weeks in this precise way, knowing without looking where exactly he was standing, the warmth of his coat a foot from her arm, her own heartbeat slightly louder than the occasion required. "Your mother used to sit here," he said. "In the summer," Cecily said. "She would read here in the afternoon. She said the arbor made the light calm." He was quiet. Then he said her name. "Not Miss Ashmore. Cecily." He said it the way one says, a name that one has been deciding whether to say for some time, with the weight of the decision behind it, and the deliberateness of a man who does nothing carelessly. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had now seen twice, and could read correctly. The expression of careful arithmetic that had produced an answer he had not expected, and was looking at it now, directly, rather than at an angle. His coat collar was turned up against the November cold. His hands were at his sides. "I find," he said, "that I do not wish to leave." The words fell into the frost-quiet garden. She held them. The arbor, the dormant roses, the cold bench her mother had placed here because the light was calm. She was aware of the specific silence between one thing and the next, the held breath before a step that cannot be retaken. "Then do not," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, with that careful, direct attention. Then he took one step closer, close enough that propriety would have had an opinion about it, and he took off his right glove and held out his hand. Just his hand, open. She looked at it. His bare hand, November cold, entirely still, entirely. She pulled off her own glove and put her hand in his. He closed his fingers. Not tightly. With precision. They stood in the rose arbor without saying anything else for some time. The frost on the grass was melting in the pale morning sun. The oak at the edge of the lower pasture moved slightly in the wind, the last of its leaves letting go, one and then another, and then a small, quiet rush of them. There was still a great deal to manage. The solicitors, the formal arrangements, the tenants who would need reassurance, the season she would eventually return to. None of that had ceased to exist because of a hand held in a garden. She thought about the codicil, about her mother, in November, sealing an envelope and addressing it to her neighbor in the careful hand that never faltered, writing 3 words on a cream square. When you are needed. Planning what she could plan. Placing people in the right positions. Trusting them to find each other. If this story moved you the way it moves me to tell it, leave a thought in the comments. Cecily's mother deserves to be remembered. That evening, Cecily went up to the dressing room. She opened the cedar chest. The ivory silk lay there in its tissue, the wisteria hem visible where the last fold turned it. She ran her hand over it once, feeling the embroidery under her fingers, the exact texture of those precise clusters her mother had commissioned and then repaired, and then passed down, deliberately, with intent. She did not need to wear it again. The proof had been made. The heir had been seen. She laid her hand flat on the silk for a moment. Then she closed the chest,